Local Museum, 41 South Street, Tuesdays and Saturdays, 9:30 to 12:30. We've got a lot of neat new stuff, photographs. If you haven't seen our shoemaker's bench from 1850, the head shoemaker from Sturbridge Village came and was very impressed by it. And you know, it is said that it might be nicer than the one he has, so please come see it. So we're almost ready. Oh, and I'll give you a warning. Next month, October 31st, I am doing a talk on creatures of Massachusetts. Don't come. I did immense research. I wrote it last week. The night I did the Devon Devil, I realized I left my phone in the car and it was dark and I was too scared to go get it. And then the night I finished the Pukwudgies, I was too frightened to leave my house for quite some time. So don't come, because it's really, I'm scared, almost scared to give it, and if nobody comes, then I won't have to do it, because I think I got a whole bunch of books and stuff, and you're not going to believe what's out there.
We'll be here.
You're never going to want to leave your house after dark again. So I'm warning you, don't come to it. It really is, yeah, I'm saying, my phone's in the car. I have to go outside. And I'm looking going, I don't see anything, but then the people who were attacked by the devil, they didn't see it either until it got them. I don't need a phone in the house. I don't need my phone in the house. Anybody who calls me, use the landline. It doesn't matter. Now, is there anybody here who does not know what molasses smells like? No. Okay, if you want to, you can sniff it later. And I'm going to tell you, the talk isn't as good as I wanted it to be. It's Eleanor's fault, my best walking buddy. I told her I was thinking about staging a reenactment of the explosion, and Eleanor tells me the senior center wouldn't like it if it got all over the ceiling and the walls. So I said, okay, well then I'm going to have little packets of molasses I'm going to throw at people, and Eleanor says, people aren't going to like being covered in snow. So it would have been better with the explosion and the throwing, but Eleanor said not to, and I love Eleanor dearly, and I didn't do it.
Thank you, Eleanor.
There you are. Thank you, Eleanor. I know, sometimes she's a buzzkill.
Wow, lots of people here.
But she's my best walking buddy, so I listen to her. There's a seat here and here.
There's a couple seats.
There's there, and there's one over there, I think. So, there's another chair. Molasses is more popular than I thought. Okay, it's 11:02. Oh, Jerry has molasses cookies.
Anita, this one. Next to Bobby.
So we will have molasses cookies for everybody to take at the end, if you can still. We love Jerry. Okay. Oh, good.
I had counted on 22 when I had people in. So,
Oh, thank you. Okay.
1990.
Oh, and they are homemade. These are homemade molasses cookies, which do tie into the story. Pick up yourselves later, that's mine. Sorry. Is that unkind? Thank you, Jerry, we love you. All right. So, we will begin, as we always do, with the times we're talking about. 1919 Boston. The Great War, World War I, was over. The soldiers were coming back. It had ended November 11th of 1918. The soldiers were coming back, but many of them were suffering from what we now know as PTSD, and what they called shell shock then, which was not, sadly, considered honorable. So people kept it quiet, but the people at home didn't know what to do about it. The soldiers were coming home, and many of them were finding that their families had died because of the influenza epidemic, which started in Boston, September 11th, and spread. They shut down the schools and the salons and the saloons. and anything public was shut down to try to stem. Stores opened at staggered hours, so crowds weren't downtown, and forcible talking in public, like what I'm doing, was prohibited. Nonetheless, 6,000 people died in Boston. So this was the atmosphere. People were coming back from the war, people were a mess. Life started to go back to normal, but in October from the flu, but still. In 1919, the life expectancy of men was 48, of women it was 51. The annual salary was $750 a year. Food for a family of 5 was $11 a week. Work it out. A car was $826. Most people didn't buy cars. Still had horses. A 7-room house with electricity was $5,200. To rent an apartment in Boston, depending on the location, $11 to $20 a month. Rooms were 50 cents a week. Some rooms were $4 a month if it was on the ground floor, 10 to 15 if it was on an upper floor. There were hardly any leases. Occupancy was conditional, so if you complained a lot, you were thrown out. That figures into our story too. So life was hard in Boston, and it was about to get harder. On January 16, 1919, the amendment for the prohibition of alcohol was to be ratified, and to give the businesses time, it was to go into effect 1 year. So all the liquor companies were going, oh my God, I gotta sell everything. Let's make as much as we can and sell as much as we can, and then God knows what's gonna happen to our business. But January 15th became a whole lot different and a nightmare in Boston. 21 people would die. 150 would be injured. Some of them would eventually die. $7 million in property damage was done in their money. In our money, that's $100 million in damage. Most people have never heard of the Great Molasses Flood. Nobody famous was killed. Nobody who was injured or survived ever became famous. It was all immigrants and office workers in the north end of Boston, a very poor area. So, the molasses tank was built in Boston in the north end. This is what it looks like today. There's ball fields and bocce courts and everything, and that's where it is. It was built by Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of U.S. Industrial Alcohol, USIA, on Commercial Street in Boston in 1915. It's made of steel. It's 50 feet tall, that's it, 90 feet in diameter, 240 feet in circumference. It holds technically 2.3 million, over 2 million gallons, about 2.5 million gallons, but it had never been filled. It was built to hold the molasses offloaded from the ships from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the West Indies. The ship comes in Boston Harbor. It has a pipeline that goes along and puts it in the tank. And then the tank is offloaded to the trains, the freight trains on the top deck, and the trolleys are underneath. Unfortunately, the big thing labeled shed had horses in it. The other buildings had wagons, horses, and men. There was a carpenter shop, a blacksmith, the fire station 51, the fireboat 31. So that's the north end of Boston. It dominated the entire area. I mean, it was the biggest thing around. They'd load molasses onto the freight trains, which would take them 1 mile to the plant in East Cambridge. Some of it went into rum, but because of the war, 90% of it went into industrial alcohol, which is the major ingredient in dynamite, smokeless powder, and other munitions. It was sold to Britain, France, Canada, and the US government. And the alcohol was needed very badly in 1915, so the tank was built in a hurry. Oops. This is a mistake. And after World War I, there was a police guard put around it. Because World War I not only brought all the men with PTSD, it also brought anarchists. And the anarchists started out as protesters. Get rid of the big government, let the people govern themselves. And it evolved into violence. We remember Sacco and Vanzetti and all that sort of thing. They liked to throw bombs after a while because people weren't listening to them. So because there had been some bombings in the area, USIA put a police guard on it, and eventually they even put up a fence. The tank always had some seepage and sometimes outright leaks. And the molasses in it in the sun would ferment, as they called it, boiling. Now when something ferments, as you know, it sort of gets a lot of air in it, it builds up a lot of gas. We all know about fermenting and that sort of thing. Sudden temperature changes would set it off. It is said that the whole area around the tank smelled like horse poop, seawater, and molasses, and it really wasn't that bad. I'm not saying that Glade should come out with a room spread. But, now when the tank was being built, one of the workers fell 40 feet and died. Ooh, cursed. Ooh.
No extra charge.
No extra charge, a little curse. The neighborhood, the owners were afraid of the neighborhood because it was mostly Italians and Irish immigrants. And many people reported the leaks. They were constantly sending letters reporting the leaks or even making telephone calls. So what would happen with the wonderful cookies here, the mom would say, we're running out of money, I want to make cookies. Junior, go get some molasses. So the kids would take jars and they'd hold it under the leaks. And the guards would come chase them off, and sometimes they'd ignore them. And the kids would take the jars of molasses home, and Mom would make candy and cookies and sweets. And if they only had a piece of bread for breakfast, at least it had molasses on it. After a nearby anarchist attack, they put the fence up, as I said. And whenever people would say, it's leaking, it's leaking, it's leaking, they'd pound the seams flat, put in a couple of more rivets, and caulk it. So what exactly is molasses? It's a product of the refining of the sugar process. You take beets or sugar cane and you boil it. The first boil, you take the crystals out. That's light molasses, very sweet, you put it on your waffles. The second boiling, you get slightly sweet molasses and different kinds of sugar. Third boiling gives you blackstrap, which is for your health, and it's a little on the bitter side. Now, in Britain, molasses is called treacle. And this is what molasses does. It doesn't seem to be in a hurry, but this is it. This is glass. And this is going to take a while to clear. Just don't try to think of yourself covered in it. Molasses is the defining component of brown sugar, the principal ingredient in the distillation of rum. It is used in dark rye bread, gingerbread, barbecue sauce, stouts and porters, some sort of beer, jerky, yeast production, and it's an additive in tobacco used in hookahs. I also believe some pipe tobacco has molasses in it, which is why you always have to clean out the pipes and stuff. 1 gallon of molasses weighs 12 pounds. December 20th, 1918, molasses was leaking from several seams, slid down the steel walls, and spread into thick pools on the ground. Maintenance came, caulked the seams, wiped it off, re-caulked them, wiped it off, put in some more rivets, all fixed, and left. Lots of maintenance on the tank was delayed to union issues and lack of employees. They didn't have maintenance people. I mean, the war and the flu had wiped out almost every able-bodied man in Boston who didn't already have a job. So they'd take the janitor sweeping the floor and say, you're in charge of maintaining the tank. I don't know how to do it, neither do we. Go ahead. Now, January 13th, 12th and 13th. Oops. Well, anyway, that's good. Boston Harbor. Number 4 at the top is the tank. Number 2 is Old North Church. Number 1 is Paul Revere's house. And they came close, trust me. And number 3 is the police station. Okay? The boat came in the harbor, it piped the stuff to the tank. Now it's January, the stuff in the tank is cold. The stuff that has been on the boat has been jostled back and forth in the boat and it's fairly warm. The warm molasses from the ship mixed with the cold in the tank. This called a bubbling mix, pushing against the sides. Pings and bangs were heard by everybody, then groans. And an estimated 39 million pounds of molasses started to ferment. The tank had never been full before. 12:41 p.m., lunchtime, January 15th, the tank ruptured. All of the molasses poured out. And it was not like a tidal wave. It went 360. It just went kablam. It exploded. It went everywhere. There was a widely felt tremor and a noise that sounded like an overhead train had derailed. Others described the noise as crashing surf, a roaring sound, runaway horses crashing through a fence, a thunderclap, tearing of metal, machine gun fire. Many of the soldiers said it was a machine gun. What was the machine gun? The rivets. They became bullets. The parts of the tank became shrapnel. There were three children gathering molasses under the tank. Two of them died immediately. The third was very badly injured and was never the same again. People felt their houses shaking. People were thrown to the floor. The temperature was 40 degrees, the warmest day in January. A man working nearby, a police officer, saw the tank apparently disintegrate as he watched. A wall of molasses, this is a great drawing, descended on people. It blotted out the sun. It was a tidal wave 25 feet high, at least 160 feet around, moving at 35 miles an hour. It's not clear yet. The patrolman, Frank McManus, called the police station and said there's a wave of molasses destroying the north end of Boston. They thought he was joking. Over 2.3 million gallons of molasses engulfed the waterfront. The crushing weight of the molasses was worse than anything else. There you go.
Wow.
That's where the tank and all the buildings and everything was. The harbor is to our right, the tracks are to our left. It engulfed a half-mile swath of Commercial Street. It crushed everything into splinters. The disintegrated tank, as I said, was like shrapnel. This was a congested area of Boston at lunchtime. Was a building. The firehouse was shifted off its foundation. The cellar filled with molasses, trapping a couple of men. Freight cars, autos, and wagons were swept up. So were people, horses, dogs, rats, wood, metal, bricks, all in a huge swirling mess. Look at the legs on those horses. They're covered in molasses, and they're lucky, they lived. These things ricocheted off buildings, swirling everything together. And as they went, they'd smash into other buildings. And there's the people searching for survivors. Electric wires were downed into the molasses. Fortunately, sugar-based liquids do not conduct electricity. However, if you're out rescuing them and you step on one, yeah. A 1-ton piece of the steel tank sliced through a column of the elevated railroad, causing the tracks above to collapse. The whole area resembled a bombed-out war zone. Rescuers initially had waist-deep molasses to drive through, to walk through.
Well, you get their exercise.
This is glass, and it's still sticking to it. glass. Now, the rescuers and 100 sailors off the nearby ships came to help, were confronted by huge blobs in the molasses that were moving. Is it people? Is it equipment? Is it a horse? Because if you go to help a person, they'll grab at you, but they'll listen to you. If you go to help a horse, he's going to kick you and knock you down with him. The police shot dozens of horses because there was no hope for them. The more you struggled, the deeper they went in. The horses died like flies on sticky paper. And what they finally decided to do, here's another view of the thing. What they finally decided to do was very clever. They went with quicksand protocol. So you take a long ladder and you lay it down and you creep across it to a place where you can stand up. Or you extend the ladder to somebody who's trapped and pull them with the ladder, or have them pull themselves out by the rungs. And this is them getting somebody out from under a building. A few minutes after the tank disintegrated, everything was just flattened and every centimeter of land was covered with the stuff. They sent people running down the train tracks in order to stop the trains, the trolleys and the trains, because they didn't need more. And the molasses held you down by suction. Still there? It held you down by suction. But the good thing about the molasses is that when it started to cool, it moved more slowly. So let's say you were behind a fairly solid, well-braced wall, and the molasses came up over the wall and poured down. You had an air pocket. There were people buried as much as 6 feet down who had an air pocket who lived. And of course, you'd be a part of a fallen building might be holding you down. The good side was there might be an air pocket there because of the building. The bad part was you had a building on you. So, you know, it's sort of, I can breathe, on the other hand, ow. The molasses oozed around the victims. It got into your ears, noses, down your neck into the clothes, sucked off the shoes when the people were walking, the boots and the shoes. Then it sucked off your socks, and it sucked off loose clothing. Now, people didn't wear tight pants in those days. And there were many people who were rescued in a state of extreme embarrassment. You know how your mother always told you to wear clean underwear in case you had an accident? This was probably one of those days. Even kept that. It demolished buildings and crushed the furniture. People were pulled out of the muck, just covered in the stuff. It's just starting to clear now. The only way you get clean is sodium bicarbonate and hot water. That's like baking soda, right? And hot water. And they figured that out. You need sodium bicarbonate. And then they had to get the victims out without making it worse. You got hit by something, your legs are broken, and they want to pull you out of the molasses. People lost legs that way. And then somebody had the brains to say, sodium bicarbonate, that's salt. Let's try salt water. And that was starting to work. And what they did with the injured, this was also clever. Well, there's people, and of course everybody comes to watch.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to help. More damage, those are the people who've been running across the tracks getting help or stopping the trains. But it gives you a better view of what's left of the tank, which is pretty much nothing. They got the ambulances to come get the people, and they used the trolley tracks because the molasses was in between the ties, and they could use the ties for some sort of traction. And that's how they were getting them out. So then they were thinking about salt water is working, but how about salt water under pressure? So they got the fire hoses from the fire boats, and they started pumping the salt water from the canal, from the harbor. And that was cutting through it and enabling them to get to more people to rescue them. The people who didn't have big air pockets, who only had weeny teeny air pockets. An overwhelming, sickeningly sweet smell overpowered everything. And this guy, as you can see, he's pulling his feet out, and I don't think he has anything on his feet at this point. But there were people who were looking for family. There were people who were looking for a way out. One man, I love this guy, worked nights. So he came home to his second floor apartment, or his house, and on the second floor, got into bed, went to sleep, sound sleeper. Woke up with a lot of noise floating down the road on his bed. The molasses had crushed the house, the wall had popped him out the window, and he landed in the molasses, still sleeping. You gotta admire that. Fortunately, he had the brains not to jump out of bed, and eventually was picked off the moving bed, and was fine. His house was a total loss, but he was alive. Victims' bones were crushed, their bodies were covered in bruises. Some victims were covered in 6 feet of molasses, but found air pockets and survived. The cleanup took weeks and months. Here's another, that's one of the buildings, you can see how it's rocked back. Finding the victims also took months. The last victim was found May 12th. 4 months later, was found still covered in the stuff. So, this is the first paper. They had 11 dead. There were 10 more and 100 more people hurt. And basically $100 million.
Wow.
And there's the prohibition thing. So why did it happen? Structural weakness in the tank, fermentation, evilly disposed persons. Which idea came from the alcohol company? Industrial alcohol used in munitions. In trying to outrun prohibition, they were trying to convert their molasses distillation from industrial alcohol to grain alcohol to make as much rum as possible, as fast as possible. Many survivors were now stricken with PTSD. The north end of Boston was a mess for years from all this. The judge reviewing the tragedy blamed the people of Boston. You didn't complain loud enough. Now, there's anarchists running around. If the Italian and Irish immigrants had complained loudly enough about the leaks, they'd have been deported as anarchists.
Yeah.
The people of Boston, you voted for the officials that never inspected it properly. So it's your fault. And industrial alcohol is going, and the people are saying, no, not a chance. Eventually, U.S. industrial alcohol was found to be responsible. The grand jury refused to bring charges. Oh, really? I'm sure it wasn't the alcohol's and company's fault. It was, the judge said it was the people's fault. The report said the tank was inadequate, the steel walls too thin and not enough rivets. USIA said sabotage, dynamite. Those soldiers coming back from World War I are all nuts. They blew it up. People who were coming back wanted a better life. If USIA offered them a job and said, you're maintaining a tank, yeah, I got a job. You got it. I can feed the family. I'll figure out how to maintain a tank. The industry was plagued by strikes. Bombings were frequent in Boston. Even with this, the victims want justice. There's one guy, I lost my wife and my kid. I have 6 more kids to take care of. My house is gone. What am I supposed to do? The legal authorities decided to lump all the cases into one. 119 separate lawsuits into one. The Superior Court found themselves facing 125 attorneys at once, with many more stuck outside. So they said, we're going to get an auditor. One lawyer, one man, is going to decide the whole thing. We'll go with what he says. So the auditor first says, okay, 2 teams, small teams of lawyers can come in. They can rotate. So they got the best guys in the field on both sides and had 2 small teams of lawyers. They could send out for somebody if they needed it. The trial lasted for 3 years. Basically, USIA played mostly on emotions and fear about the anarchists. They paid more than $50,000 to experts to testify it was anarchists. The victims produced evidence about the leaks and the missing rivets. Their lawyers proved the USI people had no idea what they were doing in the building. They had no idea how to maintain the tanks. The guy in charge of it had no idea about mechanics, building, or anything like that. Then they produced all the survivors of the tragedy one by one. The USIA attorney's closing remarks took up 200 pages of testimony. The auditor, Hugh Ogden, was offered really great things. He was a soldier who had served with honor and distinction. He gave a 51-page report to the Superior Court of Massachusetts. There was no sabotage. It collapsed because of structural weakness. The tank should have been built more safely. Here are the diagrams for the building of the tank. You use smaller, more inferior steel, thinner steel. Your fault, pay up. And it was never inspected by anyone with experience in steel tanks. One time at the museum, we called to have our furnace cleaned. They sent some guy who didn't know how to clean an oil furnace. So he gave up and went home. They sent inspectors who didn't know how to deal with a steel tank as opposed to a wooden or an iron tank. The man in charge had no technical or mechanical training, never responded to reports of leaks. They found USIA liable the damages of $300,000, that's $30 million today. It's a fairly small sum, and the victims were poor. $6,000 to the family of the people killed. $25,000 to the city of Boston. $42,000 to the Boston Elevated Railway. The rest were injured, prorated by how badly you were hurt, anything from $6,000 to $7,000. Oh, you only lost one leg? And they paid all the doctor's bills. The survivors were incensed. They wanted more money. We want another trial. USIA, we're broke. We have no money left. Oh. So the lawyer Damon Hall, who was a very tough lawyer with experience, the survivors got him. USIA doubled the payments. Gave more to survivors permanently disabled. It was all finally settled 10 years after the tank ruptured. Meanwhile, those people had to figure out a way to pay their bills and get homes and function. The molasses trade in Boston, active for 300 years, was over. There hasn't been any more molasses in Boston since. This is the place in the North End now. That area there is where the tank was, and that is the marker. Notice it doesn't mention the company. Killed 21 people, a 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks. Structural defects in the tank with unseasonably warm temperatures contributed to the disaster. A gift of USIA, oh no. But it is said, to this day, if you go to the north end of Boston, you can still smell the molasses. And that's what I have to tell you about the Great Molasses Flood.